Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving the extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. We're going to first start off with something that General Ben Hodges has said. It should give us a lead into the main topic. I'm going to dip into a lot of what Ukraine the Latest had on a recent podcast that I think is so valuable. How Ukraine is neutralizing Russia's biggest advantage, says this Newsweek piece. So, quote, I think most people are looking at this with the wrong context, Hodges said of the months-old counteroffensive. The slow pace of this, of which has raised concerns in the West, that Ukraine's troops will not be able to eject Russian troops from the occupied south of the country. Such fears have prompted fresh talk of negotiations that might see Kyiv forced to surrender territory and its ambition to join NATO. Quote, what I think Ukrainians have done correctly is to focus their efforts on destroying artillery, destroying headquarters, destroying logistics, Hodges said. This is how you neutralize the only advantage the Russians have, the advantage of mass. By taking away their headquarters, taking away their artillery that's required to support them and make it difficult for Ukrainians to get through minefields. And then finally, the logistics, taking out ammunition and transportation. Think about what the counteroffensive is for. It is for achieving some operational level objectives, and you don't do that with just ground forces. You have to use what NATO calls multi-domain, air, land, sea, cyber, information, special forces, all of the different domains. That's US doctrine, that's NATO doctrine, that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. Hodges said critical voices in the Pentagon should think twice. Quote, there's no way we would send an American soldier to do what the Ukrainians are having to do because we would never go in there without air superiority. Any criticism of how the Ukrainians are doing it or how they're not going fast enough is really wrong and misplaced. Okay. So this concentration on artillery. We've seen that reflected in the general staff figures released on a daily basis. Says Kut me or RC out me. I'm not sure. Here, thank you for this comment. Watching a few videos, take with a boulder-sized salt, the possible reason for so much artillery now being destroyed. They have knocked out the air defense systems of Russia. The drones are now able to move about with impunity. The artillery is no longer able to hide effectively, so the drones are now spotting everything. I am seeing a lot, and I mean a lot more artillery destruction videos with multiple systems being blown apart. That was not something that was happening 4 months ago. The Russians had anti-drone systems in place to take out those air recon systems. Now the artillery is at the mercy of air recon and they simply can't adapt. They are in essence sitting ducks. In my Frontline update, I don't know when this is going out, so it might be yesterday, there was a claim from Romanov, the ultra-nationalist around the Kherson area, that the Ukrainians are hammering the Russians with artillery. This is a Russian complaint that the Russians don't have counter battery and they don't have electronic warfare, and this is kind of going to that point. So that could explain why there are so many artillery pieces being destroyed, and the Ukrainians are having success in that area, but they need to continue doing that for a number of months before they really start pushing in with their infantry and those combined arms maneuvers. Just gonna, before we go to the Ukraine the Latest, let's give it another bit of an introduction by way of what Richard Kemp, who's a retired colonel in the British Army, says.
Today I've seen with my own eyes at the front line the Ukrainian counteroffensive that's been running now for getting on for 4 months, and I've witnessed exactly how tough that fight is for the Ukrainians and for the Russians as well. But it's the Ukrainians that are trying to break through extremely strongly defended Russian defensive positions, which is an incredibly difficult task, particularly without air superiority, and in fact with Russian air superiority.
So he goes on to then say where the advantage the Ukrainians, where there is an advantage for the Ukrainians is in drones and how they use drones as recon, and he waxes lyrical about that. Of course, the Russians have that capability as well, but I think it's the idea that the Ukrainians should have more of it. They've got support from United 24 and gazillions of drones going to the front line. So I think that is important, but he recognises how difficult it is for the Russians. Now, this is quite a long segment here, and I really do want to do it all in one video because it's just so valuable and I don't really want to split it up, but we'll see how it goes. As ever, go and subscribe to Ukraine the Latest podcast, or watch it. Subscribe to the Ukraine to the Telegraph channel, so you can watch. These are so worth listening to on a daily basis. I don't think I've missed one in over a year. Yeah, really good stuff. This is, I think, Roland Oliphant talking after being on the front line and speaking with. He's just done an introduction saying that he had spent time with a group that had been, or troops that have been put together for the counteroffensive and been fighting for 3 months. They've been given all the shiny gear. So these guys had your Bradleys and American rifles and everything like that. Interestingly, and I think it comes in this section, there is quite widespread condemnation of NATO training. Generally, something I've talked about before. Some of you come back, some of you in the forces, and say, no, this is you can't say that. The training is great, but I think there is quite widespread criticism for at least certain elements of the training. Like they're saying that some of this stuff is just not relevant for us. Like that's not the kind of warfare we're fighting. But we'll come to that later.
They were created for this fight, and I spoke to some guys who'd been in combat basically for 3 months at that point, so went into action on the first day of the offensive. And when I was there, they were still, and when I spoke to them, they weren't literally in action. They were in a rear area, resting up under some trees in an area concealed from Russian observation. But effectively their unit was still in combat at that point. And yes, I mean, as you described, their account of it is absolutely exhausting and really, really, really difficult terrain, going up against what they described as incredibly well-prepared Russian defenses. I wouldn't use the word they had respect for their opponent. You often see that as a trope of military writing and reporting about wars. But they definitely weren't underestimating the Russians on the other side. You know, they were not playing down the professionalism or the motivation of their enemy.
Which is an interesting point there. I mean, I'm victim of this, which is you look at certain elements of complaints from Russians and of the Russians in certain areas, like low morale, poor equipment, poor training, no counter battery, all of these issues that they will have. It's not that that's made up, but the question is that representative of everyone? And no, it isn't. And where the Russians have sent their best troops, which is exactly what he's talking about here, they are going to be having their best troops, and they won't have issues with ammunition and training equipment and morale necessarily, or at least the lack of morale won't have a tangible effect. So we must be careful in how we evaluate the Russian forces.
And there was also, I think, fair to say, a degree of anger about how things obviously didn't go well at the beginning of the offensive. In fact, one of these guys was in a fighting vehicle on the first night of the offensive, heading towards in this armored thrust that was meant to punch through the front line. His vehicle was struck very quickly by an anti-tank missile fired by a Russian helicopter. The Bradley, to be fair, he says the Bradley saved his life. The Bradley survived that hit, and everyone inside survived it. But that initial attack, as we all know now, basically ground to a halt very quickly. And these guys basically said it became very clear to them, speaking simply as ordinary squaddies. We're talking about privates and junior NCOs. The highest ranking person I spoke to was a captain in a sapper unit. The opinion was it was pretty clear to the ordinary grunts that wasn't going to work within a few hours. And then, of course, there was this big change in tactics, which we still see today, but which hasn't yet really generated that breakthrough that everyone was hoping for.
Well, we'll get onto the tactics and the changing tactics slightly later, but just before that, could you set the scene a little bit? You've written quite a lot about the geography of the battlefield in the south. Could you talk more about that? What is it exactly, and how does it impact and influence the fight that's going on?
Yeah, so this part of Ukraine is relatively flat. So basically, the kind of southern third of Ukraine is something called the Pontic Steppe. And that basically means Pontic refers to the Black Sea. It's the steppe on the northern shore of the Black Sea. It's generally flatter than you'll see in Donbass, where we get into a kind of massif with kind of low rolling valleys and things like that. But essentially it was in its natural state before settlement, which is only a few hundred years ago, really. It was a steppe, a wild field. It was traversed by Tatar nomads and Cossacks and people like that. But there wasn't much permanent settlement and so on. That began to change in the kind of under the Russian Empire and around. Sorry, I know this is a bit of a history lesson, but we're getting to the point, all right? I promise. And then late 19th century, kind of end of the Russian Empire, early Soviet Union, you really get into kind of industrialized agriculture and things like this. And some bright spark.
This is so important because actually, historically this was a dust bowl, and it's only not a dust bowl really because they've been able to do industrialized agriculture, which means dependent on irrigation and damming the river, using that to water this whole area, and then you have the tree lines to stop erosion and the winds taking the topsoil away and whatnot, and as a result, this is the land that you have.
Came up with the idea of, look, this is very open, it's very fertile land, but very open, very exposed. What we need here are windbreaks to prevent, if you're going to sow this area, to prevent seeds and topsoil from being blown away. It began, this process of planting trees in this area, which was not a forested area, began before the revolution in 1917, but it really gets going after the Second World War. And there's a kind of a full kind of Soviet Union-wide plan for this kind of thing. And the result is, if you look at a map of the battlefield, if you look at Deep State or something, you will see it. The landscape is divided into these fields that are it's not completely uniform, but it's about, most of these fields are about a kilometre-ish across and probably maybe 2 or 3 deep. It varies a bit, but basically squares and rectangles divided by these tree lines that were planted as windbreaks. And those tree lines have now matured into, quite impressive, thick places. So in some places it's quite thin, some places it's quite a thick forest strip. Good, big, strong oak trees, holly, poplar, quite a lot of kind of, for the biologists around here, insect life, mammal life, bird life is kind of supported there. And one of my theories is that that's why when we drive through that part of Ukraine, the car gets covered in kind of dead insects in a way that you just don't see in Britain anymore these days. And I kind of suspect that the tree lines are sustaining that biodiversity. Anyway, so that's the history, but that is what is defining the entire battlefield. And what these guys said to me was, this is a tree line war. The fields are completely flat, completely exposed. There is nowhere to hide. There is no way to approach the front line without being spotted by Russian surveillance drones. The same is true of the Russians on the other side, by the way. It's almost entirely transparent battlefield. Your only cover anywhere is the tree line, which means everybody digs in to defend the tree line, which means you've got to assault the tree line. Your best way of approaching the tree line you've got to assault is to fight your way up the perpendicular tree line that leads to it, because it's in a grid pattern, right? These tree lines meet each other at right angles. So every tree line is fortified. Everyone's dug in there. The trick is to assault the tree line, capture it, but then you've got to get enough of your guys in before another counterattack comes in. And essentially, the entire battle, the way these guys described it, had become this tree line defined war. And that's what they count progress in. That's what they're talking about. You see a lot.
And so that means it's just basically infantrymen doing this fighting. You might have some support from infantry fighting vehicles, but when you've got so many mines around and when you've got ATGM teams sitting in those tree lines, then that becomes too risky for the vehicles. So the vehicles end up dropping the people off, then running off again. And it has to be, these are people fighting from place to place. And then you tell me who has the advantage, right? The person sitting in a trench or the people trying to attack the trench? It's the people sitting in the trench. So this will be attritional for the attackers, and it will be difficult, and they are going to struggle to take over these trench lines fighting this way. And this is the problem of not having air superiority.
A lot of this analysis about the Surovikin line and they're through the dragon's teeth, or you can draw these lines on maps. That's a little bit misleading, I think, talking to these guys, because actually it's not just those big trench systems that people can spot on satellites and say this is where the Russians are. Actually, basically every single tree line, they're dug in ATGM teams, covered trenches, all kinds of complex defensive systems, and all of it fronted by landmines. So you can imagine how formidable an obstacle that is, and that has a lot to do with why things are going so slowly.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for that. That's very comprehensive. So let's bring this back to the tactics then. You've sketched out the nature of the battlefield. We've talked a little bit about the slow progress made right at the beginning and indeed the slow progress now. So could you just chart for us how Ukrainian tactics have changed in the past few months?
Yeah, so they went into this basically attempting a classic kind of armoured breakthrough, blitzkrieg as you will. They went in with armoured vehicles and tanks. They basically drove straight at the Russian lines. The idea was to punch a hole through, infantry dismount, clear the trenches, you create a breach, and way off we go, all the way down to the Sea of Azov with, you can draw arrows on maps going in all kinds of different directions. As soon as the vehicles run into these incredibly thick minefields that cannot be quickly cleared, and suddenly Russian anti-tank guided missile teams are popping up in the tree lines and knocking out the vehicles, it becomes clear that.
And it's not just ATGM, so you've got mines and you've got mines stacked on mines, so it blows up the mine clearers. You've got trench lines, you've got infantry in there, you've got helicopters with a range of anti-tank guided missile on board that's greater than the manpad's range firing back at the helicopters, so the helicopters have a range advantage. And you've got Russian aviation hammering lines with FAB 500 bombs, so it's just massively difficult.
They have to switch to smaller units, so it's actually, the way they were describing it, is relatively small groups of men fighting their way usually up along the tree lines, and then they have to gain a foothold in a Russian trench, expand that foothold, then get enough people in to hold it because the Russians will counterattack. You have to move in quite small groups because, as I was saying earlier, the battlefield's basically completely exposed to surveillance and drones. Getting through the minefields is incredibly difficult and incredibly slow, so you'd have to have a lot of reconnaissance to work out where the gaps in the minefields are, and if not, to punch through them. I mean, one of the sappers I was talking to was saying, well, actually, quite often what we have to do if we're working with the infantry and we're right on the front is we will assault. So the sappers will assault with the infantry into the Russian position through the minefield, and then only then they start working back to clear a path through it. So incredibly difficult. And when you get into these fights in the trenches, it's incredibly close quarters stuff, which comes down, a lot of the survival seems to come down to luck and sheer kind of refusal to give up in a way. But they described a specific fight to me. It was frankly terrifying. And the way they said, we're basically incredibly lucky to have come out of that alive. But they did take that trench.
Well, finally, Roland, could you just tell us that story? I mean, I know it forms part of the end of your dispatch is these soldiers talking you through exactly that, how they assaulted a Russian trench. Can you tell us from their perspective what happened?
Sure. So this was a Russian position somewhere in the Robotynya area. I spoke to them just a few days after they'd done this, and I think they were still a little bit shell-shocked about what they'd been through. So this was a classic Russian position, a trench dug into a tree line, very well defended, huge minefield in front of it. This was the fourth attack, they told me. So the first attack failed, second attack succeeded, was kicked out by a Russian.
I'm making out where this is taking place, of course, with looking at the map, but it gives you some kind of indication, right?
Counteroffensive, counterattack. Third failed again. So this was their fourth try. And the way they did, they managed to identify through reconnaissance a gap in the Russian minefield. Instead of going straight for it, they and this is, I think they were quite lucky with this because this time they did get their vehicles out, which they don't often want to risk them. So they flanked this tree line. So if you can imagine, you're facing a tree line. They went round, I suppose you're facing it the left-hand side with their Bradleys, got into the field behind it, drove along about halfway, and then they dismounted from the Bradleys and they assaulted through the tree line towards the Russian trench that was facing Ukrainian positions on the north side of the tree line. And pretty much everything, he said to me, it's a cliche, but everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, and it's always like that. Everything goes wrong. So the idea was that there'd been a preparatory bombardment and the Russians were meant to have given up or run away. They hadn't. The Bradleys came in and shot up the trenches with their anti-personnel ammunition. It didn't really work. The trenches were 2 meters deep. The tree line was pretty thick, so that wasn't effective.
And that's really worth emphasising. Like I said before, artillery doesn't often do enough damage to these trenches. Same with the armaments on a tank or on an infantry fighting vehicle. Yeah, you get a direct hit on a particular place, but if you're a tank and you're firing at a trench, that trench is on the same level as you need to come down into the trench. It's very difficult for a tank or an infantry fighting vehicle to get the angle to cause trouble to the trench line. So these are the wrong types of vehicles. Again, you just need to flatten those, blow the integrity of those trench lines up with A-10 Warthogs or whatever, dropping untold amounts of ordnance, but then you're never going to get those operating in the skies above Zaporizhia.
Reconnaissance had identified these kind of little communication trenches that they were going to get into to gain access to the main trench system, but they couldn't find them. So they just found themselves assaulting through these trees, get into the trench. And the guy said, it's the first assault team, about 5 people. Within about 2 minutes, 3 of them are wounded. There's only 2 still fighting. Grenades coming in from all directions. Gets in the trench. One of the guys tells me 3 grenades go off straight away. First guy takes most of the shrapnel. Second guy takes some as well. I'm standing behind them, and there's a lot of smoke from grenades. I'm asthmatic, so I start having an asthma attack, but I've still got to fight. So he's then confronted by a Russian soldier. He thinks he's only about 4 meters away from him. It's dark. There's muzzle flashes firing at him. He fires back at the muzzle flashes. They both miss. The Russian tries to run away get out of the trench and run away along the top. Lifts his rifle and fires at him, misses. Describes throwing grenades, firing his rifle, taking his inhaler out of his pocket, taking a suck, putting it back in. And they're stuck there for about half an hour, expecting the other teams from their company and the other battle.
I'm going to interrupt here because this one anecdote is an anecdote concerning, say, a tree line. Let's, for example, say it's this tree line, right? But then what about this tree line? What about this tree line? What about that tree line? What about this tree line? What about that tree line? What about this major trench? What about these trenches? What about this tree line with trenches in? What about these trenches? What about those fields? What about those fields? What about these fields? What about those fields? What about these? What about that tree line? That tree line? That tree line? That trench? That trench? That trench? That trench? That trench? And then suddenly you're like, holy cow. What they need to do is phenomenally expensive in terms of personnel. Just not in terms of losing those personnel, just the number of personnel you need to try and do that to all those tree lines is absolutely mind-boggling. So that's when you see, okay, let's stop concentrating on Velika Novosilka and let's concentrate on Robotina. But even just this one area, the amount of forces you need to expend and the forces that you'll lose, in order to take all of these tree lines. And then once you get past those tree lines, you've got the main trenches. And then once you've got past the trenches, you've got, actual towns where you're fighting house to house, and you've got people that's staying in basements, protected from artillery. This is so difficult.
At least to come and support them, but they don't really understand why then taking so long. And eventually, one of the guys who's still fighting kind of assumes that the guys who are meant to come in on the flank are arriving, but they're not. So he assaults down the trench, realizes he's assaulting all by himself. And he's incredibly vulnerable. And he said, well, what he did was he just grabbed a Russian machine gun and got it back to where the other guys were. And they used that machine gun to hold off the Russian counterattack until finally, after about half an hour of this, the rest of the company came in, cleared the position, and secured it. So a huge amount of luck. And then they were reflecting on it and they said, well, actually thinking about it, what won that fight? Well, we knew that if we tried to retreat, we would be dead in like 2 minutes flat. We had no choice. And the Russians were able to fall back to a position. That's basically what decided that fight. So that gives you an idea of the realities of trying to take ground in these, in this offensive, which I think we're still saying is still going on. But if you're wondering why it takes so long, it's so slow for that little bulge on the map to expand, That's why.
Roland, hi mate, it's Dom here. Really interesting perspective there to describe the ground as you are. And I was just reminded, it sounds very much like the bocage of northern France, sort of after D-Day. It took the Allies weeks to get out of after they'd made the beachheads, it took them weeks to then push on, because the ground sounds fairly similar. It was sort of high-sided lanes with hedgerows that covered anti-tank teams running around all over the place. The tanks were moving in those lanes, couldn't really see over the top. And the way that the villages were scattered around there, and the trees and the forestry blocks, as you described, they were all within a couple of kilometres of each other, which was just perfect anti-tank range. So as the Germans had all these little groups of infanteers that were able to effectively produce a lattice work, a network of kind of an anti-tank matrix, basically. So it took the Allies weeks to get through all that. It sounds pretty similar. I mean, we need to get Francis back to have a proper historical analysis and see what kind of the casualties that were taken and what kind of effort it took to get through that, because it does sound very similar. And I've been told from elsewhere that the minefields not only incredibly.
So, and that's absolutely right. Very similar to the bocage, but I think even harder. What with the variety. The Germans didn't have helicopters that had 8-kilometer range of anti-tank missiles, and maybe even more with some of the later ones. They didn't have anti-tank guided missile range of like 5 kilometers, so on and so forth. They didn't have drones flying around. This is exceedingly difficult. And I don't know, this is more of a whinge. There's no answer to this other than, my opinion would be to just lay back on doing this kind of offensive work until you have so thoroughly degraded the Russian capabilities in terms of armor and air defense. And if you can get an air defense advantage, if you can take out the air defense that much, that you can start maybe moving your planes a little bit closer. But if you can degrade the armor that much that you can then use, and I've said this before, use your own drones further and further in, so they're not going to take it out. But then you're thinking, electronic warfare, but you're a point where the enemy armor is so degraded that actually you can just electronic warfare the whole sky, or as much as the areas you can, which will mean that your drones can't fly, okay, but the enemy drones can't fly. So the enemy, like the Russians, have a lack of air defense, they have a lack of armor, they can't use their drones, okay, you can't use your drones. That's when you can start moving your troops and armor itself. That would be my solution to that. But it is not easy. I mean, they go on to talk about how every trench is then booby-trapped. So not only do you go in and take these trenches, but the sappers then say, don't touch anything. You see that's meant to look like a booby-trap, so you go, well, there's a problem, and then you're going to do something else. Well, actually, if you think it's a problem, it's because they're highlighting something. Actually, the problem's over there. So you have all these kind of double bluffs, and everything is booby-trapped, and it takes, much longer to secure these trenches so that you can actually use them because they're so dangerous. So there's so much to consider in terms of succeeding with this counteroffensive that makes it really challenging for the Ukrainians, and that translates into taking much longer, and that translates into people then having fatigue and losing the will to support as much. I mean, here you have a trench line within Crimea. That's not to say the trench lines around Robotyne are going to look like this, but the longer you have to prepare, and the Russians are having longer and longer now with how grinding the counteroffensive is, the more these trench lines will start becoming even more difficult to take and better fortified and so on and so forth. So let me know what you guys think. I'm probably going to leave it here. Obviously, so much more to say, but I've let Ukraine the latest do a lot of talking there. I will just end on one thing, which is I saw today coming out from Anton Gerashchenko, charging. It's actually loads of people are showing this, charging multiple launch rocket system, the Grad multiple launch rocket system, Russian army style, second army in the world, they said. I mean, I wouldn't want to be doing this to try and get the missiles into or the rockets into the loader there. But just if in doubt, whack it with a massive box. Bit scary. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all your support. Toodle pips. And I will update the members thanks list as soon as I can. Sorry, it takes quite a long time for me to do, so I will do that this week. Toodle pips.